So this is, I can't remember what number we're up to. It's our second last one, I think, of our fallen mediocre clubs. This week we are looking at the Illawarra Steelers. So before we get started, I feel not wrong including these guys. These guys, for me, they don't really fit into that category of that club that popped up for 2 or 3 seasons in the 90s and then fell away. They definitely fell away in the 90s, but they, came into the league in 82. That was their last logo as well. They're obviously famous for this guy. First of all, let's analyze the logo. You seem to be very good at this. What is with that helmet? Like, is that a helmet that you wear down in the steelworks? I'm not too sure.
I don't know. It's possible, like, it's a visor, maybe looks like a welding helmet, maybe, but then I just don't know. The face shield isn't covering all his face, so it's only really covering his eyes.
What's going on his shoulders? Like, what happened to his arms?
The funny thing is, it's like he's built himself medieval armor out of steel, which makes sense, but at the same time, this is a very American college football logo.
Yes. Yeah.
And I don't, the color scheme is red and black, which is pretty, standard, inoffensive. I don't hate it, except for the fact that his helmet looks ridiculous. The giant S poking out in the face shield. Maybe just don't have the helmet.
Yeah.
The logo was considerably better, I reckon. But
this was their last couple of seasons. The guy looks a bit more intimidating with the muscles and the hard hat.
His shoulders look terrifying, to be honest with you. Look at his delts. I'll tell you what, that is and the sledgehammer itself is very symbolic of being powerful and dangerous, and that's the kind of guy you just wouldn't want to mess with. He's got the big chest, the big muscles, the big sledgehammer, and he actually looks like a steel worker. Me being so blue collar working class, definitely can recognise a steel worker, but that to me is what I picture when I picture a steel mill.
It reminds me like there's a lot of sporting clubs in Poland that have like stal, which means steel, because the town had a local steelworks. So it's very much reminds me of that. Anyway, so let's dive into the Illawarra Steelers. So they joined the NSWRL in 1982, the same year the Canberra Raiders joined. So that was the league's real first expansion since 1967, and the real first expansion outside of the Greater Sydney area. Although I think when Penrith joined in 67, I don't think Penrith was really considered Sydney back then. But anyway, it was really the first time when those two clubs joined that the league branched out of Sydney. I should mention, excluding, there was a Newcastle team that entered in 1908 that only lasted 2 seasons. But anyway, but listen, the reality is Illawarra were pushing to be part of the Sydney League, the NSWRL, whatever it was called at the time, even since the early 1930s. But they seemed to always get vetoed by the country rugby leagues, because Illawarra was obviously a big, strong area, and they didn't want them to join the City League, I guess. So they were actually going to join in 67 until the CRL blocked the move again. And therefore the league then needed to get another club because they didn't want to have an uneven number of teams. And that's where Cronulla Sutherland stepped in. So if the Steelers actually joined in 67, Cronulla Sutherland may have never actually joined the competition. Anyway, the region's always massive rugby league nursery. And so when they joined the league, Illawarra Leagues Club, as all the clubs at the time, was the major financial backer. But after a couple of years, there was a recession in the early 80s, and BHP Steel jumped on to save the club in 1984 and basically stayed with the club till their final season in 98. So that's good loyalty, I guess, from BHP Steel. Obviously, that was probably the major employer of the town for many years. And the name Steelers, again, it's a no-brainer. There's a massive steel industry in the city of Wollongong and in the region, and so that's where the name come from. Now, the scarlet colour is thought to have been adopted from the Illawarra flame tree, and it's also, I think, that red, white, and with the tinge of black is also, I think, general Wollongong city colours. If you think about the Wollongong Wolves, famous NSL champions back in the very early 2000s, they had very similar colour scheme to Illawarra Steelers. Their first 8 seasons wasn't great, produced 3 wooden spoons, but then things started to improve sort of in the late 80s. In 1989, the club reached the final of the Panasonic Cup. Have you heard of the Panasonic Cup, Dubs?
You know what? That name actually sounds vaguely familiar, but I'd be I'd be lying if I said I could tell you what it is.
I would love to bring this back. It was basically like the English have got the Challenge Cup or in football there's the FA Cup. It was basically like a national cup for rugby league. It was played midweek, so you'd have like a combined Brisbane team. There's even a Victorian team played 1 or 2 seasons. You'd have a team from New Zealand. So anyway, the Illawarra Steelers made the 1989 Panasonic Cup finals. It was like the national cup competition. They reached the final. They lost 22-20. However, it was controversial. Brisbane scored off what appeared a forward pass. And then the Broncos were booed. Broncos were booed at the end. And then Brisbane captain Wally Lewis gaining their ire by gesturing back. So Wally Lewis was not a popular man in New South Wales. Early 90s came along and it saw improved results. The Steelers licensed club, I think it was another type of leagues club. They basically came to existence and helped financially. In 1992, they took out the preseason 2-ish challenge, but 92 is most famously remembered. They finished 3rd, made the finals for the first time. They knocked off St. George in the first week, went through to the prelim. No, not the prelim, some other final. No, not the prelim. But anyway, then they lost to Brisbane, and then they lost again to St. George in the prelim. There we go. So that was their best ever season. 92, where they were only 1 game away from the finals. The only other year they made the finals was 97 in the ARL season, where they finished 6th. And they were bundled out in the first week by last week's club, the Gold Coast Chargers. Now, the best part of the whole story is the story about their mascot, Stanley the Steel Avenger, more commonly known as Stanley the Steeler. He was, let me see if I can get a photo up of him. Well, that's not him. I'll go back to him. We'll go back to some of these. There we go. There's Stanley the Steeler in like a space helmet. I think I've got another photo. There we go. There's Stanley the Steeler. So Stanley the Steeler is famous for being, I'm pretty sure, the only ever mascot that has been sent off the field by the referee. So in a game back in 1995 between Illawarra and Balmain, a scuffle broke out on the field that Stanley the Steeler got involved in. I think the reports say that he was trying to break up the fight, but the referee sent him off the field. And there was in the papers the following day, it was also written in jest that Stanley the Steeler would have to face the judiciary and potentially face a suspension. So that definitely has to be mentioned. And it's up there with, remember the Western Reds episode where there was a bunch of Western Reds hooligans bashed up the KFC or the Red Rooster mascot?
I do remember.
The mascots were really in the thick of it back in 1995. Could you imagine Stormman, just, like that night Curtis Scott's throwing haymakers against Manly, Stormman getting involved and like pushing away the Manly players? Or it'd be great. We need to
Stormman, he could do some damage.
Yeah, we need to get the mascots more involved. The mascots should be like the beef ambassadors. They just come on the field and they just have to stir up the beef amongst the opposition. Anyway, so let's mention Super League because obviously they were around during that time. So Super League hit in 1995 and the Steelers were in for a rough ride. I think they were struggling financially. I don't think the Steelers ever were financially very strong. Good work in becoming a credible force in the competition went out the window after the sacking of Graham Murray was the only incident where anyone in the competition lost their job because of Super League. Although there were, I think, players that were not played because they may have been with the ARL club and they signed Super League. But that's another story. Basically, Graham Murray told the players that they should talk to Super League and talk to ARL before making a decision. And the club committee was clearly going to stay loyal to the ARL. Illawarra and its supporters remained loyal to the ARL, though board member and then Speaker of the House of Representatives, Dr. Stephen Martin, resigned from the club, citing they need to join Super League for the club to survive. Martin will be proved right with less than 3 years. If you actually look at it, obviously when Super League finished, they dumped the Reds, they dumped the Mariners, they dumped the Rams. But the rest of those clubs that went to Super League actually survived, whilst a lot of those ARL clubs had to merge and whatnot. Anyway, so after the peace made in 98, the league made it clear they wanted a 14-team comp by 2000. And the Steelers approached St. George. The Steelers knew that they weren't going to survive on their own. So they approached St. George and initiated the joint venture talks. There was also discussions, I think, with Western Suburbs and Cronulla. But Steelers CEO Bob Millwood claimed the club's preferred partner was St George, and I think it's been a pretty good merger. It seems like, St George had the money, no juniors. Illawarra had the juniors, no money. So it seemed like they filled each other's gaps, and it seems like pretty much the St George. But it's nice that they still, when they play in Wollongong, they'll wear the red jerseys of the Steelers. And yeah, so that's pretty much it's history of the Illawarra Steelers. Now, I should also mention they still field standalone teams in the Tasha Gale Cup, which is the women's under-18s comp in New South, the SG Ball, which is the under-18s, and the Harold Matthews under-16s. There was a club called the Illawarra Cutters that was formed in 2012, and they played like in the New South Wales State League, but in 2017 they were replaced by St George Illawarra. So that's and obviously don't think there was really any Storm players. I couldn't really think of any off the top of my head, but Melbourne Storm first ever game was in Wollongong away to the Illawarra Steelers that ended in a win for Melbourne. So yeah, I guess that's where Illawarra has its place forever in Melbourne Storm's history books. So that was the Illawarra Steelers. Now let's go through the photos, Dubs. So I don't know what this is, but I found this on a Facebook.
Very ugly doll.
It's like one of those Chucky dolls. I found this on a Facebook page. It was like Illawarra Steelers fanatics, just full of like old memorabilia and stuff like that. It's scary. I would not want to be given that as a kid. That's Craig Fitzgibbon. It looks like it's from '98 season. It's got the NRL. It has to be '98 because it's NRL. That's some players. I don't know why I included this photo, but they all look happy. BHP Steel. That is the classic, Illawarra jersey. It kind of reminds me, what, Dubs? A bit of the hockey jerseys, the ice hockey.
Little bit, yeah. Big shoulders.
Yeah, but you know how all those ice hockey jerseys will generally, they generally have the logo in the middle, but then on the sleeves they'll have, those two stripes.
Yeah, that's true.
But I like those jerseys. They were plain, but they were simple. As Mary, there we go, Trent Barrett. Look at his face there. And Mary McGregor. So two sort of coming out of that 90s. Now, here we go. This is from a website called leaguetees.com.au, Free Stanley Steeler. So I think this is a reference to his moment where he got sent off. Yeah, great T-shirt there. There's another one of Trent Barrett playing in 98. Can't remember who this gentleman is, but it looks like it's 95. Yeah, there's their jersey, that famous BHP Steel scarlet jersey. There's Stanley the Steeler. There's Mary McGregor again. There's their first team from 1982, first ever Illawarra team. There's Stanley, the famous mascot.
I love this Stanley the Steeler.
Yeah, he's one of the most famous mascot. This was a couple of old Steelers in front of the Steelers club. I really should have done a bit more research who these guys were. Now, you should know this. This is Rod Wishart. He's one of the, I think, Steelers' most famous players. Rod Wishart. And that's it. That finishes up. Let's finish up with Stanley the Steeler, kicking up his feet. Yeah, and that's the story of the Illawarra Steelers. So obviously they're still around today in the form of the St George Illawarra merger. Yeah.
So you're right, very different from a lot of those other clubs in that they had a lot more of a basis in traditional rugby league. They had a much stronger roots in the community, but just didn't have enough to stand alone. They're from that very interesting 1998 season where clubs that had a famous long history, not necessarily just the Steelers, but your North Sydney Bears, Balmain and Wests, they wouldn't last in the form that they were in. And Balmain and Wests merged, and then of course the Steelers reached out to St George Illawarra, adding one bit of Melbourne Storm connection. The 99 grand final, of course, there were a couple of those players that came in from the merger into that St George side, like McGregor and Trent Barrett, who were in that grand final side and went on to have pretty good career. Well, certainly Barrett did pretty good careers with the St George Illawarra Dragons. McGregor was getting a little bit older by that stage, so I don't know how much longer he went off the top of my head, but obviously it did good things for St George Illawarra because objectively they were probably the best team throughout the home and away season that year or close to it. And they were one of the best, and certainly going to grand final day, a lot of them thought that a lot of fans thought they would get the better of us, and they very nearly did. So Illawarra were a powerhouse in 1999 and then rose again a couple of times over the ensuing years, and for some reason haven't been able to keep that rise consistently in the last 3 or 4 years, but a lot of strength in that club, made only stronger by Illawarra becoming part of it. So the interesting thing is, just giving you an example, if you click on the St George Illawarra wiki page, you have to click separately to see the whole St George history. So they very clearly defined that the St George history is no longer applicable, which does seem to me very harsh way to view it. It is a merger, not the end of a club. It's a joint venture. Okay, fair enough. I understand St George Illawarra isn't St George, but I would have thought the collective histories of both clubs can kind of be shared in that, but apparently not.
Yeah, like
Illawarra is a 20-year-old club.
But the thing is, though, like when they won the comp in 2010, everyone, all the even the build up, first time in 31 years,
Yeah.
blah blah blah. So they are really continuing on the legacy. It's basically St George has just added Illawarra, and they play a few games in Wollongong. I mean, that's the way it seems to me. I'm sure that I'm pretty sure there's like a 50% ownership agreement, and I'm sure the juniors are done differently and all that. But from the surface level, it seems like almost a St George takeover. But
yeah, it's mostly St George with Illawarra. It's a shame actually that there isn't greater representation down there. I know it's good that St George play a couple of games in Wollongong, because it's a shame for us though, because you can fly to Sydney to watch a Storm game up there, or you can do as we've done, drive up for grand finals, which is a great road trip. But a road trip to Wollongong is considerably more manageable. You can kind of do that in a day, a long day, but you take off that extra couple of hours it takes to drive to Sydney, and you can actually make a really good day trip of that, or an overnight or something in the country. Definitely. It's a lovely drive up through the Riverina. So anyway, side note there, kind of a shame to see that Illawarra doesn't have a club anymore, because it is a nice area. And yeah, just an interesting one, completely random side note. Of course, great sporting family, the Barretts. Trent Barrett's cousin is actually Luke Bruce, who's played 200 odd games now for the Mighty Hawks in the AFL. And footy fan and an NRL fan, you can definitely see the rugby league youth that Luke Bruce had, the way he fends tackles. It has nothing to do with anything other than I'm a Hawks fan. I just wanted to drop that in.